Carbon is the biggest disruptor of the 21st century, and the world as we know it is changing. Eco-engineers can guide you to make the best decisions as you navigate toward your clean energy goals. Our diverse team of carbon analysts, engineers, scientists, auditors, and regulatory specialists are trusted advisors of the clean energy fuel sectors worldwide. Clean energy regulations are a maze. We simplify them with an unbiased approach and fully manage your compliance. Modeling your carbon reduction is complicated. We quantify your emissions with a rigor based in science. Together, we can create markets that will protect and grow your investment. We create sustainable solutions for a better tomorrow. We are eco-engineers.
Thank you for joining the Eco-Engineers team today to cover part one of our two-part webinar series on the US EPA set rule that was announced at the end of calendar 2022. In today's webinar, we'll be covering the eRIN pathway part of the set rule that really covers the launch of the eRIN rule and how eRINs will potentially be generated at the beginning of 2024. And next week, look for the second part of our webinar series that will cover more of the structural changes in RIN generation, separation, the RVO, proposed RVO, and also the change in generation of RINs to a quarterly schedule for the eRIN RINs that will be generated. So joining us today, co-presenting along with me, are Dan Chacha, our EV Services Director, and Sean Gasson, Carbon Consultant, and also our RNG Consulting Team Lead. Dan is going to start the webinar today with a conversation around the EV market and lead us into more details about the US EPA eRIN set rule.
Great. Thanks very much, Dave. I think it's important to understand where electric vehicles are, both globally and domestically, in terms of adoption rates and where the industry is going. So 2022 was actually quite a banner year, and it might be sort of considered a turning point year for EV sales globally. 10.5 million EVs were sold in 2022, and that represents a 55% growth rate from the previous year. Battery electric vehicles, that would be full battery electric rather than hybrids, have consistently been more than 70% of that sales figure. And I expect that to grow and grow as battery and range increases. New EV sales globally right now represent 13% of the overall vehicle market, and there are about 26 million EVs in operation. So there's been quite a growth trajectory over the last couple of years in particular, as we've emerged from supply chain issues and COVID effects. But that's been a little bit unbalanced in terms of regions around the world. So Europe was initially a very fast starter, a very fast adoption, and they've kind of plateaued a little bit. They still had a very strong 15% growth rate in 2022, but that was down from the previous growth rates in years before that. China is leading Asia and the world right now in terms of growth and the absolute number of electric vehicles. They had an 82% market growth in 2022. And here in North America, we have had a 48% growth rate from 2021 to 2022. And that has actually transpired in spite of a contracting overall market for vehicle sales. So if you look at that column there, total market for all vehicles, it's actually been contracting across all vehicle classes, but electric vehicles have been growing within it. So it's been a very resilient market space and growing quite rapidly, and we expect that to continue, particularly with all of the regulatory and incentive programs in place. So this is where really the Renewable Fuel Standard is engaging in this market as it's growing to help foster and get a strong foothold here in the US.
Thanks a lot, Dan, for the summary there on the EV market. And I'm going to invite Dan back a little later to help us characterize the supply and demand of the renewable electricity and the EV market and how that will play into the eRIN market going forward. But first, I'd like to invite Sean Gasson to talk to us about the US EPA RFS program and how the EPA set rule has outlined the upcoming eRIN program.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, I'll start by giving a history of the RFS program before talking about some of the changes therein. So the RFS program was passed by Congress in 2005 and readopted in 2007. The RFS program is intended to replace a portion of fossil fuels used in transportation in the US with biofuels. The goals of the RFS program were to reduce the U.S. dependence on foreign oil sources and incentivize the development of advanced biofuels with a greenhouse gas emissions reduction of 50% or more. The original RFS program set a target of 36 billion gallons of renewable fuel by 2022. When Congress passed the RFS program, they only detailed out the RVO schedule until 2022, with the intent to turn over the administration of the program to the US EPA for 2023 and beyond. In December of 2022, the US EPA released the proposed set rule, which outlines how the US EPA will administer the program for 2023 through 2025. One of the major inclusions in the proposed set rule is how the EPA will implement the eRIN program or the Renewable Electricity Program. It should be noted that renewable electricity is already approved in the RFS program, although there are no approved projects or renewable electricity projects participating in the program due to the US EPA's concerns over double counting and who will be the RIN generator for renewable electricity projects. The proposed set rule outlines the methodology that the US EPA will use to implement the eRIN program and addresses some of the original concerns that the US EPA had for renewable electricity. So next, I'll talk about some of the pathway options for biogas producers and the major roles for the new renewable electricity pathway. So historically, in order to participate in the RFS program as a biogas producer, you had to upgrade the biogas into renewable natural gas, where it could be used as a transportation fuel, either as CNG or LNG. Under the proposed set rule, the EPA is activating the renewable electricity pathway, which will allow biogas producers to produce electricity, interconnect with the grid, and contract with EV manufacturers or OEMs in order to generate eRINs. The US EPA identifies three major entities in this pathway process: the biogas producer, which is the owner of the digester or landfill, the renewable fuel producer, which is the renewable natural gas producer or renewable electricity producer, and the end user, which is CNG stations or CNG fleets for renewable natural gas, and OEMs for the renewable electricity pathway. And next, I'll talk about some of the highlights and major inclusions in the set rule for the implementation of the program. So the EPA states that quarterly fleet numbers and disposition data will be used to determine EV electricity consumption. Plug-in hybrids will be included for the use of eRIN generation, but at a fraction of the energy use of full EVs. And then the US EPA identifies OEMs as the best positioned to demonstrate the amount of electricity being used as a transportation fuel, stating that OEMs already collect the data necessary, which is the fleet size and vehicle miles traveled. A couple of key components to the eRIN program is a significant change to the eRIN generation rate, where 1 RIN is now equivalent to 6.5 kilowatt hours, where previously it was 1 RIN was equal to 22.6 kilowatt hours. EV manufacturers, or the OEMs, will be responsible for generating and separating RINs. And then finally, the 3 major roles, so biogas producers, renewable electricity producers, and OEMs will be required to register through the EMTS system in order to participate in the RFS program.
Thanks, John, and I appreciate the summary there of how the EPA has outlined the regulatory process for eRINs. And now I'd like to turn it back over to Dan to talk a little bit more about the commercial process and how we see entities participating in this market and how the value of these eRINs might be shared.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dave. As Sean mentioned, there are 3 major players in the value chain for generating RINs through an electric vehicle pathway. There are the biogas producers and the electricity producers who will convert the biogas to electricity. Those are your renewable energy providers. And then there are the auto manufacturers, the vehicle manufacturers, also known as original equipment manufacturers, or OEMs. The renewable energy producers will produce that electricity, inject it into the grid, and provide a contract for the electricity to the OEMs. If in that process an RNG is used as a biointermediate, then the renewable energy producer will have to retire those RNG RINs prior to converting to electricity. And it's important to note that for the electric producers, they will still be able to generate RECs in addition to RINs. So it's an additional revenue source, not a replacement revenue source. As far as the OEMs go, the vehicle manufacturers, they will, Sean mentioned, be the eRIN generator and separator. They will enter into contracts with those renewable energy producers for the ability to generate those RINs. All 3 parties, the biogas producers, the electricity producers, and the OEMs, will all need to be reporting into the EMTS system that the EPA manages and update on a quarterly basis that activity in the fuel pathway. It is presumed that the revenue would be shared once it is generated through the OEM, that it would be shared to all 3 parties in the process. So what would that look like? There's quite a bit of potential here. The EPA has broken this down in their draft regulatory impact analysis document, which is cited there if you want more details on this. But essentially, they've looked at the first 2 years here of implementation when eRINs will be generated. That's the 2024 and 2025 calendar years, and looked at the electricity that all the electric vehicles on the road would be anticipated to require in those years to meet the regulations of the miles for each of those vehicles. And they looked at the amount of procurement that would be required on the supply and how much generation could possibly be registered within the program. So they really see that the limiting factor initially is going to be getting all the full pathways registered in the program and doing the process for getting all of those registrations lit up and active. So looking at their values there of 8,023 gigawatt hours in 2024 and close to 10,000 gigawatt hours in 2025 as the anticipated amount of electricity that would qualify in the program, that would generate 600 million RINs in 2024 and double that in 2025. That translates to $1.8 billion in 2024 of total revenue potential and $3.6 billion in 2025 of total revenue potential. So that's pretty significant. This all assumes a D3 RIN value of $3. Now that is a market-based commodity, so that will fluctuate, and today it has eroded a little bit under $3, but there's still a substantial amount of revenue potential here. If we break that down further and we look at the estimates on what that would look like for each of those stakeholders, the EPA estimates it would be a total of $838 generated per EV that is on the road. And if that were split 3 ways evenly between the OEM, the electric provider, and the biogas provider, that would equate to $279 per EV every year for the OEM. It would also equate to $121 per megawatt hour for the electricity generator and $54 per MMBTU for that biogas generator. So substantial increase in potential revenues and new revenues for a number of these stakeholders. We would expect that the demand for electricity will initially be a little bit lower than supply because of the number of electric vehicles versus the amount of biogas electricity available today. But as EVs begin to really turn the corner in terms of adoption in the US, we would expect that the demand for that electricity will be significantly higher and really push that supply higher than the supply. So great opportunity here for all of these stakeholders. What's the timeline? When can you get involved with this? The set rule, as Dave and Sean had mentioned, was released in this past November, December timeframe. That was the proposed set rule. It went into a comment period, and the EPA is now finalizing that, and they will be releasing that final rule in June of this year. There may be some changes to it, but we don't expect there to be significant changes to what we've described here. The EPA has said they will begin processing those applications for new electric pathways starting 60 days after they finalize the rule, which puts us in August or late summer of this year. eRIN generation, the ability to actually generate RINs and generate revenue under this program, will begin January 1st of 2024. So that gives a very short time frame between August of 2023 and January of 2024 to get pathways filed and registered with the EPA. We expect a very high number of pathway applications in this time period, and the EPA does as well. The EPA has said that any pathways that have been applied by the end of this year, even if they're not approved on January 1st, those pathways will be able to generate and earn RINs while that approval process is taking place at the EPA. The biogas producers, renewable energy producers, and OEMs have to start thinking about how to participate in this program, and they must be registered and maintain compliance obligations to be an active stakeholder in the program. So what are the next steps if you're in one of those roles and have the ability to participate in this program? Renewable energy producers, that's the biofuel producers, the electricity producers, and the OEMs are all positioned to start taking advantage of this program really today. We encourage all stakeholders to start engaging a third-party engineer, analyze the feedstocks, need to get site visits scheduled, reports written, and all of this needs to be collected and submitted to the EPA to participate in this program. We do expect a significant surge of applications and activity starting in August of this year. So we would encourage you, to reach out to us, reach out and start the process for building up that registration packet so that you're prepared to submit that to the EPA in the third and fourth quarter of this year.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Sean, for the great summary and insights here on the proposed eRIN program. You know, this program has been much anticipated for a number of years, and it's going to be an exciting summer of news and updates from the EPA and activity. As Dan stated, with potentially billions of dollars of revenue each year coming from this program, and the tight timeline and potential regulatory constraints of EPA approvals. Many entities are already actively working on this program and determining how they can be first in line to benefit from this program. So really appreciate the insights today. As we look forward to next week's webinar, part 2 of the series, I want to thank our regulatory engagement and compliance experts who've poured over hundreds of pages of the set rule and really helped us distill this set rule into these 2 webinars. And next week, we'll be covering, like I said, more of the structural changes within the set rule that are important to current registrants and people generating RINs in the program. And it's important to understand what those changes are and how they may affect your registration and ongoing compliance, even if you're not participating in the eRIN set rule. So thank you very much for attending today and look forward to seeing you next week.